If God is good and gracious, then why is there so much bad stuff going on in the world? It's a pretty common question. You may be watching this video because maybe a friend of yours who's a Christian sent this to you, or maybe you're just surfing around the internet and you found this and you may have actually had this question. It may even be a thing that prevents you from believing the gospel, from believing in God, serving God, whatever. Is okay, Christians say God is good, but if he's good, if he's gracious, if he's kind, if God is love, why is there so much bad stuff going on out here? It's actually a pretty good question, but there are a couple of ideas that I think are missing pieces in understanding the answer. So here's the first missing piece that's pretty important that a lot of us overlook. In the beginning of the story of the world, as told by the God of the Bible, the world began under God's power and his guidance and his creation. And yet, right after he created it, he entrusted it to humankind. You can read Genesis chapter 1 and see this, where God tells man and woman, humanity, he says, have dominion. And he speaks about all the things in the earth. He says, you guys have dominion over this. In other words, God created the world, and then he handed the keys to human beings and said, all right, this is your show. Now listen, you need to listen to me because I'm the one who created this thing. I'm the one who created you. I know how this thing should work. So you should listen to me, but ultimately the fate of the world is in your hands. That may be a little bit too strong a way to put it, but when you read Genesis chapters 1 and 2 and actually into chapter 3, that's what you see. That's why whenever man sins in Genesis chapter 3, it ruins everything. God subjected the world to futility because man had extracted himself, ourself, from God, from God's will, from God's goodness. God is good. God is gracious. God created the whole world because of his grace. But then we extracted ourselves from that by saying, you know what, God? No thanks. We're going to do it our way. We're going to do it the devil's way. We want to run the show. We don't really want you telling us how we should run the show. And so God allows that because God's not going to force people to come to him or to receive his goodness. And so he has allowed us to run the world into the ground. And actually every single evil thing you ever will find in the world in some way traces back to man's sin and therefore the rebellion against God and the consequences of extracting ourselves from God. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying that a baby born with cancer, that means, well, that baby did something bad and that's why they have cancer. No. But that is a byproduct of a system that's been broken by humanity's sin. And it's in that broken system that God is trying to bring restoration and healing. And that's actually what his grace is all about, is to fix what we have broken. He has involved himself in our problems. So that's probably the first misconception where people say, if God's so good, why is the world messed up? Well, the world is messed up because actually is a byproduct of God's goodness of allowing us to have dominion in the world, and our conduct and our behavior and us removing ourselves from God has created all these bad things. That's the first thing that's important to reflect upon whenever you think about all the bad stuff that's going on in the world. By the way, if you want to learn more about that, read Genesis chapters 1 through 3 and Romans chapter 8. Great texts that help give some framing or from some explanation of that. Romans 8 verses 18 through 25 in particular. But here's the other thing that's really important to realize. And that is, some people say, well, if God is gracious and God is good and God is kind and God is love, then why is there so much bad stuff going on in the world? What if things going well or going poorly in the world isn't really the point anyways? What if there's something beyond this world that's really what this whole thing is about and what God is really working toward, and therefore what his grace is ultimately all about? Here's the deal. A lot of us think if things aren't going well for me in the here and now, then God isn't showing me grace. There was a devout Christian, more than a devout Christian. He was one of Jesus' specially appointed messengers, the apostles. His name was the Apostle Paul. He had a lot of things going wrong for him in his world. A lot of people rejected him. He was impoverished at various times. He just struggled. He got beat up. He got arrested unjustly. He faced unjust imprisonment. You add up any bad thing you see in the world today, the Apostle Paul probably experienced it, including some sort of physical malady, which he refers to in 2 Corinthians chapter 12 as a thorn in the flesh. It's unclear what exactly that was, but most likely it was some sort of physical bodily trial, some sort of illness or sickness that he dealt with. And he actually prayed to the Lord. This is a guy who had a direct link to God, more than most Christians have ever had, more than most human beings have had. He had a direct link to God because of his position as an apostle of Jesus Christ. And whenever he prayed multiple times that God would remove this, it didn't happen. He was told no, but this was something that he was going to have to bear up under. And I want you to listen to what Jesus' response was to him. Verse 9 of 2 Corinthians chapter 12. When Paul was praying, take this away, help me, by your grace restore me out of all the, whatever it was he was praying exactly. In verse 9, it said, and he has said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is perfected in weakness. And then Paul reflects and says, most gladly, therefore, I will rather boast about my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. Therefore, I am well content with weaknesses and with insults and with distresses, with persecutions, with difficulties, for Christ's sake. For when I'm weak, then I'm strong. Here's Jesus' answer whenever we say, oh, there's so much suffering and there's so much trouble, and why doesn't Jesus just fix it? If God is good, why doesn't he fix it? Why doesn't he take away the hurt? Why doesn't he take away cancer? Why doesn't he take away war? Why doesn't he take away all that stuff? Well, remember, number one, this is part of the deal. He gave us authority and therefore responsibility to make choices in the world, and a lot of this is either a direct or indirect result of our sin and our rebellion against God's good and gracious will for us. But number two, whenever you question, why is all this bad stuff happening? Why is he not removing it? Well, because his grace is enough. And his grace is not primarily geared toward fixing every immediate problem that you have, and every physical malady you face, and every time your bank account's running thin, and every time people are jerks to you, or every time you lose your job. That's not primarily what God is interested in. There's something deeper. There's something more meaningful. There's a power that's meant to reside in your soul and transform you to be able to endure whatever difficulties you may face in the world. And you will face difficulties in the world. Jesus himself faced difficulties in the world. And certainly no one received grace more than Jesus, the very Son of God. And yet he went through suffering. He went through weakness and through peril. And in that, his power was made perfect. And the same is true for you and me. The real grace of God is to get in us a strength, a power, a resilience to overcome difficulties. Not just to escape them entirely. Not just to have them removed from our presence. But his power in our weakness is enough grace to see us through. And ultimately, what his grace is all about is not just about seeing us through our day-to-day difficulties, but one of the beliefs of the Christian faith that there is a God who created the world and who wants people to be recreated and made what he made us to be in the very beginning, so that we'll live on forever, so that we'll live on past this world. That's why Jesus can say, look, I know you're going through a hard time, and I know nothing seems right now, but my grace is enough for you. Is it enough for you? Do you trust him? Do you believe him? If not, how can we help you with that? Send us a message here on Facebook or YouTube, wherever you're watching. Go to our website, The Way BK. Let us know how we can help you to understand this grace so that you can embrace the reality that his grace, even through whatever trials and difficulties and burdens and bad things you see in the world, his grace, even in your weakness, especially in your weakness, is enough.